It was not addressed to any government office or military command. It came through a standard diplomatic relay, plain text, no encryption, sent to the Human Trade Bureau on Reach Station like a letter dropped into a mailbox. The Galactic Conclave, it said, would be holding its 63rd Grand Summit at Aurelius Point in 30 standard days. Humanity was welcome to send observers, not delegates, not negotiators, observers. The woman who read it first was a clerk named Bryn. She forwarded it up the chain without comment. By the time it reached the desk of the Director of Outer Affairs, 3 other people had already marked it as low priority. Ada read it twice. Then she asked for a map of the disputed Star Corridor. She had spent 31 years in trade negotiation. She had worked cargo disputes between colony ships, water rights arguments between 3 different moons, and one extremely complicated inheritance case involving a dead shipping magnate and 6 species of lawyers. She was 62 years old, and she had never once raised her voice in a negotiation room. People who worked with her said it was because she never needed to. She booked passage to Aurelius Point the next morning. She brought 2 assistants. One was Paul, a young man who had studied interspecies economics and could read Voreth financial documents faster than most people could read plain text. The other was Riva, a woman in her early 30s who had grown up on a border station and spoke 4 alien languages without an accent. Ada brought physical notebooks, printed reference documents, and a small case she did not open on the ship. Aurelius Point was a neutral station, old by any standard, built at the intersection of 4 major transit lanes during a time when 3 of the current conclave powers had not yet developed faster-than-light travel. Its halls were wide and curved, designed to accommodate dozens of body types and atmospheric preferences. The lighting in the main conclave hall was a compromise blue-white that nobody loved and everyone could tolerate. The hall itself was built in a wide semicircle. Delegate tables curved around a central floor where speakers stood. At the back, separated by a low railing, were the observer seats. 12 rows of plain chairs, mostly empty. Ada and her team took seats in the 3rd row from the back. Nobody came to greet them. The other factions had arrived with full delegations. The Voreth sent 11 representatives led by a senior ambassador named Orvin, a sharp-featured man in layered dark robes who walked like someone who had never been told no. The Sulkai came in a group of 8, their bioluminescent skin markings shifting slowly in the station air. The Dravathi sent 4, which was typical for them. They preferred small teams and long silences. The Morn Collective arrived last, a group of 7 in identical pale uniforms, moving with the synchronized ease of people who had worked together for decades. None of them acknowledged the human observers. The summit opened with a formal reading of the disputed corridor's history. It took 4 hours. Ada wrote notes the entire time, filling pages in her small, even handwriting. Paul pulled up star charts on a quiet handheld device. Riva watched the other delegations, tracking who spoke to whom, who avoided eye contact, who tensed when certain sections were read aloud. The corridor itself was a stretch of space roughly 40 light-years long. It contained 3 habitable moons, 2 confirmed mineral deposits of significant value, and 1 gravitational anomaly that made transit through it 17% faster than the routes around it. Every major power wanted access. None of them wanted to share. The Voreth had been using it informally for decades. The Sulkai had legal claims from a treaty signed before the Voreth claims. The Dravathi had a colony ship sitting at one end, not moving, not communicating, just sitting. The Morn Collective had infrastructure on 2 of the moons that they had built without asking anyone. Humanity had a research outpost on the gravitational anomaly. It had been there for 11 years. Nobody mentioned it on the first day. On the second day, the factions began presenting their proposals. Each one drew the corridor lines differently. Each one gave itself the largest share. Each one found polite language for the phrase "this is non-negotiable." The Voreth proposal gave humanity nothing. The Sulkai proposal did not mention humans at all. The Dravathi and Morn proposals offered observer status on a joint committee, which was a polite way of saying a seat in the back row. Ada listened to all of it. She ate her meals in the observer section. She did not speak to any of the other delegates in the hall. In the corridor outside, during the first recess, she stood by a viewport and looked at the stars for a long time. Paul came to stand beside her. He asked what she was thinking. She said she was thinking about how much work the other delegations had not done. On the third day, a Sulci representative gave a 2-hour speech about historical rights. On the fourth day, the Vorath and Sulci had a procedural argument that lasted most of the morning. On the fifth day, the Dravathi said almost nothing, and the Morn Collective submitted a revised proposal that was nearly identical to their first one. On the sixth day, Orvin stood at the podium and delivered what he clearly intended to be a closing statement. He laid out a framework that gave the Vorath primary transit rights, the Sulci secondary access, the Dravathi their colony corridor, and the Morn their infrastructure maintenance rights. It was a four-way agreement. Clean, he said, efficient, ready for signature. He did not look at the observer section. Ada stood up. She did not raise her hand. She did not wait for recognition. She simply stood, and the quality of her stillness was such that Orvin stopped speaking mid-sentence. Every head in the hall turned. She walked to the central floor. She placed a thick-bound document on the table. She said, clearly and without any particular emphasis, that humanity had a counter-proposal. Then she returned to her seat and waited. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Orvin looked at the document on the table the way someone looks at an unexpected object on a clean floor. He did not pick it up. He gestured to an aide, who carried it to him with both hands as though unsure how heavy it was. It was 412 pages long. The Vorath aide set it down in front of Orvin and stepped back. Orvin looked at the cover page. He looked at Ada. He looked at the cover page again. Around the hall, delegates began leaning toward each other in low conversation. The Sulci representative nearest the aisle craned her neck to read the document title from a distance. Ada sat with her hands folded in her lap. Drell, sitting 2 rows behind the main Vorath table in his capacity as a senior advisory observer, watched the human woman and felt something he did not immediately have a name for. He had studied human behavior for 9 years. He had read their history, reviewed their treaties, analyzed their trade patterns. He had expected them to complain. He had expected, perhaps, a formal written protest or a request for amended language. He had not expected this. He quietly asked an aide to obtain a copy of the document. The session was recessed for 3 hours to allow delegations to review the counterproposal. Ada spent those 3 hours in the observer section eating a meal she had packed from the human quarters. Paul sat beside her working through the document on a handheld, making notes. Raval watched the exits. What the document contained was not what anyone expected. It opened with a complete survey of the corridor's resources, more detailed than anything the other factions had submitted. Mineral projections, transit traffic modeling, atmospheric data from the 3 moons, 17 years of gravitational readings from the anomaly. The data sources were all cited. Most of them were from human research teams. The outpost on the anomaly, it turned out, had been collecting data the entire time it existed. The second section proposed a shared infrastructure framework. Relay stations at 6 points along the corridor, jointly funded on a proportional basis, accessible to all 6 factions without preference. The engineering specifications were included. Cost breakdowns were included. A 15-year construction and operation timeline was included, with benchmarks. The third section addressed governance. A rotating chair model, 6-year cycles, each faction taking a turn. Dispute resolution through an independent arbitration body rather than direct negotiation. Voting weights based on usage and investment rather than historical claim. It was not the system any of them would have designed for themselves, but it was demonstrably fair. The fourth section was the one that made the Sulci delegation go quiet in a different way. It contained a detailed legal analysis of every treaty, claim, and historical usage right that all 5 factions held in the corridor. It found merit in several of them. It also found, politely but precisely, that 3 of the Voreth's informal usage claims did not hold under current conclave law. The Morn Collective sent a private message to their home council within 20 minutes of receiving the document. The message was flagged in transit by a routine monitoring system. It read, "The humans did their homework." When the session resumed, Orvin spoke first. He was measured and careful, which was not his natural mode, and the effort was visible. He said the counter-proposal was interesting but premature. He said it introduced complications that would delay the summit beyond its scheduled window. He said the framework was impractical and the governance model was untested. He looked, while saying all of this, like a man reading from a prepared script he had written before seeing the document. Ada let him finish. Then she said, without standing, that the proposal addressed all objections raised over the previous 5 days and that the floor was open for specific questions. Orvin said he had no specific questions. He said the framework simply did not fit the current negotiation structure. A Sulci delegate raised one of her secondary arms, a gesture equivalent to a raised hand. She asked about the relay station at point 4, specifically the power allocation model. Paul answered before Ada could speak, citing the relevant page number and reading the relevant passage without looking at the document. He had it memorized. The Sulci delegate sat back. Her bioluminescent markings shifted to a color Rivat recognized from her studies as the equivalent of impressed. The Drevathi said nothing, which was normal, but their senior representative was reading the document with both primary eyes, which was not. The session ran 3 hours over schedule. By the time it adjourned, 2 of the 4 allied factions had privately told their home councils that the human proposal was the most substantive thing submitted since the summit opened. Neither of them said this publicly. Saying it publicly would mean admitting the previous 5 days had been conducted in bad faith. Orvin called a private meeting with the Sulci lead that evening. The conversation was not recorded, but Drell was in the adjacent room with thin walls and good hearing. He caught most of it. Orvin wanted a unified front against the human proposal. He wanted a formal rejection at the next open session, after which he planned to offer Ada a small concession, a single relay post and observer rights, and present it as generosity. Drell sat in his room afterward and thought for a long time. Then he checked his intelligence files and found what he had been told 3 days ago by a source inside the Human Transport Registry. The human delegation had filed 2 sets of travel papers on arrival, one for a stay of 10 days, one for a stay of 2 days. He looked at the date. They had been on the station for 6 days. He sat with that information for a while. Then he went to find Orvin. Orvin did not want to hear it. He was standing at his desk reviewing the next day's session notes when Drell arrived. He listened to about 40 seconds of what Drell had to say, then held up one hand and said the humans were playing a game, that all delegations filed backup travel arrangements as a matter of routine, and that reading significance into standard procedure was the kind of thing that made advisors nervous without cause. Drell said he did not think it was standard procedure. He said the second set of papers was filed not by a travel aide but by Ada personally, using a sealed diplomatic authorization code, which was not a thing people did for routine backup arrangements. Orvin said that even if the humans planned to leave, it was still a bluff. They had too much to gain from staying. The corridor research outpost alone was worth more than anything they could get by walking out. Drell said he was not sure the humans valued things in the order Orvin was assuming. Orvin thanked him for his concern and asked him to close the door on the way out. Drell stood in the corridor outside for a moment, then walked toward the eastern observation deck where he sometimes went when he needed to think without interruption. The station was quieter at this hour, most delegations having returned to their quarters. The corridors were long and softly lit, the viewport panels showing the slow drift of stars outside. He almost walked past the 2 humans in the side corridor near Junction 7. Paul was standing against the wall speaking to a Sulkai official named Vess, one of the junior delegates who handled economic modeling for their team. The conversation looked casual from a distance, but Drell slowed his pace without stopping. He had learned over many years how to listen while appearing to walk. Vess was asking what the humans would accept if the relay station proposal was modified. Specifically, if the Point 4 station was removed and replaced with expanded access rights at existing Sulkai infrastructure. Paul thought about it for a moment. Then he said that he was not the right person to answer that, and that the proposal as written was the proposal. If the Sulkai had specific questions about the infrastructure model, he would be happy to explain the reasoning, but he could not speak to what modifications the delegation would accept. Vess pressed. He said surely there was flexibility. All proposals had flexibility. Paul said he agreed that was usually true. He said the proposal had been written to be fair to all 6 parties, and that any modification would need to be evaluated on whether it remained fair. He said this in a tone so pleasant and unhelpful that Vess eventually thanked him and walked away looking frustrated. Drell continued down the corridor and found, near the next junction, a nearly identical scene. Rava was speaking with a Morn official, a woman named Sona who handled their communications and relay infrastructure. Sona was asking different questions but fishing in the same water, trying to find the gap between what the humans had written and what they would actually settle for. Rava answered every question directly and completely, in a way that gave Sona exactly as much information as the document already contained, and nothing beyond it. Drell found the observation deck and stood at the viewport for a while. He had spent 9 years studying humans. He knew their history, their wars, their famines, their capacity for violence, and their equally confusing capacity for charity. He knew they had a phrase, a very old one from before they had ever left their home planet, that translated roughly as, "Never negotiate from hunger." He had always interpreted that as a warning about desperation. He was beginning to think it meant something slightly different. It meant you made sure you were never the one who needed the deal more than the other side. He pulled up the human counterproposal on his personal reader and went to the section he had bookmarked earlier, page 308. It was a short section, easy to miss in a document that large. It was titled Procedural Withdrawal Conditions. It laid out, in calm legal language, the specific circumstances under which the human delegation would consider the negotiation process to have failed in good faith, and the steps they would take in response. It did not threaten. It did not demand. It simply described what would happen in the same tone as the infrastructure timelines and the governance rotation schedules, as though a withdrawal was just another logistical outcome to be managed. Drell read it twice. Then he looked up the definition of the Voreth word for checkmate and sat with the comparison for a moment. He went back to Orvan's room and knocked. Orvan did not look pleased to see him again. Drell said he needed 2 minutes and did not wait to be invited in. He put his personal reader on the desk, open to page 308. He waited while Orvan read it. Orvan read it. He set the reader down. He said it was a standard procedural clause and that every delegation included similar language. Drell said he had read every proposal submitted to this summit, and none of them included that clause. He said the clause had been written with specific reference to actions that Orvan was planning to take tomorrow. There was a silence. Orvan said the rejection would proceed as planned. He said the humans were observers who had overstepped by submitting a proposal at all, and that a firm response was the appropriate way to handle it. He said if the humans chose to leave, that was their choice, and the summit would proceed without them. Drell looked at him for a moment, then he nodded and left. Back in his room, he sent a message to the human delegation's general comm channel. He did not identify himself by name. He wrote 4 words, "They will reject tomorrow." He did not expect a response. He got one within 8 minutes. It said, "We know, thank you." He stared at those 3 words for a long time. The morning session began on time. Ada arrived first, which was unusual. She was already seated in the observer section when the other delegations filed in, her notebook open, her pen in her hand. Paul sat to her left with a closed case on his lap. Rivas sat to her right and watched the doors. Orvin entered from the senior delegate corridor, his dark robes pressed and formal. He spoke briefly to two of his aides before taking his seat. He did not look at the observer section. His posture said everything was proceeding according to plan. The session opened with standard procedural minutes. Then Orvin rose and addressed the floor. He spoke for 40 minutes. It was, by any measure, a well-constructed speech. He acknowledged the human delegation's effort. He used the word thorough 3 times. He referenced the counter-proposal's data sections as genuinely impressive, which was the kind of compliment that cost nothing. He praised the intention behind the infrastructure framework. He said all of this in the careful, warm tone of someone who was about to say but. The but took 25 minutes to arrive. He said the human proposal, while thoughtful, did not reflect the realities of long-term conclave governance. He said a rotating chair model was unstable. He said the arbitration body proposed was structurally untested. He said the infrastructure timeline was optimistic. He said the data from the anomaly research outpost, while valuable, had not been peer-reviewed by conclave scientific standards. He found something to question in every section. None of the questions were wrong, exactly. They were the kind of questions that could be raised about any proposal if you were looking for them. Then he offered a counter to the counter. Humanity would receive a single relay post at the corridor's outer edge. Not the Point 4 station from their proposal, but a smaller position, a monitoring post, with maintenance rights only. They would be granted observer status on the Joint Corridor Committee, a non-voting position with the right to submit written reports. Orvin called this a meaningful inclusion. He said it reflected humanity's growing importance as a galactic community member. He said it with a straight face. He sat down. The hall waited. Ada did not stand immediately. She sat for a moment, very still, the way she had been still for 6 days. Then she set her pen down on her notebook carefully and stood. She said thank you. She said she appreciated the time the Assembly had given to reviewing the counter-proposal. She said she had listened to 5 days of negotiation and 1 more day of deliberation, and that she had a great deal of respect for the work done in this hall. Then she said that humanity had come to this summit in good faith with a serious proposal, and had received a monitoring post and a non-voting chair. She paused, not for effect. She appeared to be choosing words precisely. She said that the human delegation would be withdrawing from the talks. No raised voice, no sharp language, just that sentence standing alone in the hall like something placed carefully on a table. Then she picked up her pen and her notebook and she nodded to Paul. He opened the case on his lap and took out a single document. He walked to the central table and set it down. It was the withdrawal notice. Ada had filed it by diplomatic code 2 days ago. This was the physical copy, a formality, but formalities mattered. Then they both walked back to the observer section. Rivas was already standing. The 3 other human delegates who had been sitting quietly in the back 2 rows were already gathering their things. No rushing, no energy, just the ordinary movements of people who had decided to leave. The hall watched in complete silence. Orvin's mouth was open slightly. He had prepared for argument. He had prepared for a reduced counteroffer, a request for amendments, maybe a formal protest to be entered into the record. He had not prepared for this. His aide touched his arm and he did not seem to notice. A sulky delegate stood up. She called out to Ada by her formal title, Delegate Ada, and asked if the withdrawal was final. Ada paused at the railing of the observer section. She looked at the sulky delegate. She said it was a withdrawal from the current process, not from future engagement. She said humanity's proposal remained on the table as a public document and could be referenced by any party. Then she continued walking. The Morn Collective's lead delegate turned to her colleague and said something in a low voice. The colleague pulled up a handheld display. On it was the summary page of the human counterproposal, the governance framework, the infrastructure timeline. She was already reading it again. Drell, sitting in the advisory section, watched Ada reach the hall exit. The doors were tall and heavy, the kind that slid open with a pressurized sound. Ada walked through them without looking back. Her team followed, one by one, in the same quiet order. The doors slid shut. The hall was still for a count of 3 seconds. Then every delegate in the room began talking at once. Outside in the corridor, the summit's public broadcast relay was still running. Aurelius Point had transmitted the session live across 62 systems, a standard practice for conclave summits. The walkout had been seen in real time by an audience that numbered, conservatively, in the hundreds of millions. Ada walked with her team toward the human quarters section. Paul was carrying the closed case. Riva was making a note in her own small book. Nobody on the team said anything. They had talked about this moment days ago. There was nothing left to say about it. Behind them, through the closed hall doors, the sound of 60 delegates talking over each other rose and did not stop. The broadcast reached the Sulkai home world first because of relay positioning. A public commons area on Veth Station, orbiting the Sulkai primary planet, had the session running on a shared screen. About 30 Sulkai were watching at the time of the walkout, workers on a rest cycle, a few administrators, a group of young students on a station tour. They watched Ada stand, say her piece, and leave. They watched the doors close. They watched the hall erupt. One of the students, a young Sulkai female whose markings had not yet settled into their adult pattern, asked her instructor what had just happened. The instructor was quiet for a moment. Then she said the humans left. The student asked why. The instructor said she thought the better question was what would happen now that they were gone. On the Dravathi colony ship sitting at the corridor's outer edge, a subspace antenna picked up the broadcast 14 minutes after transmission. The ship's council watched a recording in the cargo bay, the only space large enough for all 11 council members to gather. They watched it twice. Then the council elder said that the humans had submitted an infrastructure proposal that included the Dravathi colony corridor by name and guaranteed its legal status under conclave law, and that no other faction's proposal had done the same. Several council members had not known that. They went to find a copy of the human counter-proposal. The reaction on human stations and ships was different. On Reach Station, where Ada's office was, her staff watched the feed in the common room. There was no celebration. A few people exchanged looks. One analyst, an older man who had worked under Ada for 11 years, simply said, "There it is," and went back to his work. On a long-haul transport 3 weeks from the corridor, a crew of 9 humans caught the broadcast on a delayed relay. The captain, a woman with 20 years of freight runs, watched the whole thing twice without saying anything. Then her navigator asked if the humans had just lost everything they were negotiating for. The captain thought about it and said no. She said she thought they had just changed what they were negotiating for. Back on Aurelius Point, inside the conclave hall, the session descended. The formal agenda had been the signing of a corridor agreement. Without the human proposal and without the shared pressure of presenting a unified front, the allied factions had no agreed text to sign. Orvin called for an adjournment to allow delegations to regroup. The Sulkai asked for the floor before the adjournment was voted on. Their representative said she had questions about the infrastructure framework that had not been adequately addressed, and that she wanted them entered into the formal record. Orvin said there was no infrastructure framework before the assembly at this time. The Sulkai representative said the human proposal was a public document, and she was asking for the record to reflect that the Sulkai delegation wished to formally review it. Orvin said that the human delegation had withdrawn, and their proposal was therefore not part of the active agenda. The Sulkai representative said she was not aware of any procedural rule that prevented a delegation from formally requesting review of a submitted document regardless of the submitting party's status. There was a 20-minute procedural argument about this. The Morn Collective said nothing during the argument, which was unusual for them. They were typically present in every procedural dispute. Instead, their lead delegate was reading. Drell, watching from his advisory seat, noticed she had printed the human proposal rather than reading it on a screen. She had a pen. She was making notes in the margins. The Dravathi senior representative sent a quiet communication to the main session floor. It asked, in formal language, whether the corridor agreement currently under negotiation guaranteed existing colony ship positions. It was the first substantive question the Dravathi had asked in 6 days. Nobody had a good answer because the existing draft agreement, the four-way Voreth framework, did not address colony ship positions. The human proposal did, on page 240, with specific legal protections and a 30-year grandfathering clause. The session adjourned into a mess. Orvin called a private meeting. Only the Sulkai refused to attend, citing a scheduling conflict that Drell was fairly certain had been invented. In the private room, Orvin tried to reassemble the alliance. He said the 4 factions could still reach agreement without human involvement. He said the corridor was large enough for 4 shares. He said the human proposal was a complication, not a solution. A Morn representative asked what they would do about the relay infrastructure. Currently, all 4 factions use different and incompatible relay protocols in the corridor. Transit delays because of this were significant. The human proposal had included a unified protocol framework that would reduce those delays by 30%. Nobody in the current alliance had an equivalent plan. Orvin said that was a technical problem that could be solved separately. The Morn representative asked when and by whom. Orvin did not have an answer. Drell sat in the corner of the room and said nothing. He had said everything he had to say to Orvin the night before. He watched the Morn representative's expression and the Sulkai empty chair, and the Dravathi delegate reading the human proposal on a printed copy that someone had apparently also given them. He thought about Ada's 3-word message, "We know, thank you." He had not understood all of it at the time. The thank you had seemed odd. Why thank the person warning you about something you already knew? He thought he understood it better now. It had not been a thanks for the information. It had been a thanks for being honest. In a room full of people performing positions, one person had simply said a true thing. He excused himself from the private meeting and walked to the human quarters section of the station. He knocked on the door and waited. Ada opened it herself. She was holding a cup of something warm, and she looked like she had been reading. Drell identified himself. He said he was not representing the Voreth delegation. He said he was not representing anyone. He asked if she had a few minutes. She stepped back from the door. He came in. The human quarters were plain. Functional furniture, a small table, a viewport showing the stars. Paul was at the table with documents spread in front of him. Rivat was on a comm call in the corner, speaking quietly in a language Drell did not recognize. Ada set her cup down and pulled out a chair at the table. She gestured to the one across from it. They sat. Drell said he would be direct. He said the summit was falling apart. He said the Allied framework was unraveling because the human proposal had been the only document that actually solved the corridor's core problems. And now that it was not actively on the table, everyone was discovering they had no agreed replacement. He said several delegations were privately asking whether the human team would return if conditions changed. Ada listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she asked one question. She asked whether they were asking because they wanted a deal or because they were embarrassed. Drell looked at her for a moment. He appreciated direct questions. He said, honestly, both. He said the Morn Collective genuinely wanted the infrastructure framework. He said the Dravathi needed the colony corridor protections. He said the Sulkai had been arguing internally since the walkout about whether they had been wrong to let Orvin run the rejection. He said Orvin himself was not in a position to make the ask because making it would require admitting the rejection had been a mistake. and Orvin was not built for that admission. Ada said she understood. She was quiet for a moment. Paul had stopped pretending to read his documents. Riva had ended her call and was listening from the corner. Ada said that the withdrawal notice had been filed and that it was a matter of diplomatic record. She said returning to the table would require the filing of a new participation request, which under conclave procedure would need to be accepted by a majority of the active delegations. She said that was a process, not an obstacle, but it meant any return would need to be a formal act, not a quiet reversal. Drell said he could work with that. Ada said she also wanted to be clear about one thing. She said the proposal would return with one change. The monitoring post that Orvin had offered as a concession would be removed from consideration entirely. It would not appear in the revised text as a rejected item or a traded concession. It would simply not exist. The revised proposal would treat humanity as a full corridor partner from the beginning of the document. Drell said that was a harder thing to arrange. Ada said she knew. She said she was telling him so he could decide whether to continue the conversation. He continued the conversation. They talked for 2 hours, not about the politics, about the corridor itself. Ada asked him questions about Voreth transit patterns and historical usage that went further back than anything in the public record, and Drell found himself answering in more detail than he had expected to because the questions were good. She asked about the gravitational anomaly from a navigation perspective, and he told her things he had learned as a young logistics officer 30 years ago that he had not thought about in decades. She told him things about the anomaly's energy readings that the research outpost had found, and that had not yet been published anywhere. They talked about the moons like two people who had actually been thinking about the place rather than the politics surrounding it. At the end of it, Drell said he thought he could get the Morn and the Sulkai to formally request the human delegation's return. The Dravathi would follow if asked directly. The Vorath, he said, would be last, but they would come, because Orvin was not willing to let the summit collapse on his record. Ada said that was enough. The formal request came the next morning. 3 delegations filed it jointly: Sulkai, Morn, and Dravathi. The language was careful and formal, and said nothing about why the humans had left or who was responsible. It simply invited the human delegation to return as full participants. Orvin signed his name to it at the bottom. He did not comment publicly. Ada filed the participation acceptance 40 minutes later. The human team arrived at the hall at the start of the next session. They did not arrive quietly this time. Word had spread through the station, and there were a dozen non-essential staff from various delegations standing in the corridor to watch them walk in. Ada walked at the same pace she always walked. The revised proposal was submitted that morning. It was 3 pages shorter than the original because the monitoring post section was simply gone, as though it had never been suggested. Nobody pointed this out on the record. The vote took 2 sessions. It passed with full support from 5 delegations and a recorded abstention from Orvin, which under conclave rules counted as approval. The corridor agreement was signed at the end of the 3rd day following the return. Drell wrote his report that evening. His supervisor asked for a straightforward account of why the summit had nearly failed and what had salvaged it. Drell wrote 4 drafts. The 4th one was the one he sent. It said that the summit had stalled because the dominant factions had underestimated a delegation they had not invited as equals and had paid for that mistake when the delegation left. It said the situation had been corrected when individual actors chose honesty over position. It said the corridor agreement was good and would hold. He did not include his private conversation with Ada. Some things were not for reports. The agreement became known in later years as the Aurelius Accord. Analysts wrote about it as a turning point in human conclave relations. Most of them focused on the walkout, which was the dramatic part, the part that had been broadcast live, the part people remembered. Fewer of them wrote about the 412-page document that a 62-year-old woman had placed on a table in a hall where she had only been invited to watch. Ada went back to her office on Reach Station. She submitted her summary report, attended a debrief, and went home. Her neighbors did not know she had been to Aurelius Point. She had not told them. They knew her as the woman who kept a small garden on her balcony and returned borrowed things promptly and always remembered names. She was, in their estimation, a very organized person. They were not wrong.